appreciate the opportunity to share just a little bit of an overview of Macrostrat and the paleobiology database. Just a brief overview of some of the capabilities that we have and the status of the systems. So I thought it might be nice to just kind of remind ourselves why it is we make these databases and try to synthesize data at multiple different scales into data resources that we can all use together. And ultimately, we're trying to understand the evolution of the Earth system and the interactions between Earth systems in particular. And in order to really understand how these systems have operated today and changed over time, we really have to have quantitative understanding of each one of these components of the Earth system in some form or another. And so what really drives the creation of the database resources I'm going to be talking about today are some large-scale questions that require synthesis of data and information from multiple different sources. Questions like how much carbonate is there on continental and oceanic crust, and what is its age distribution? We need to be able to answer this question quantitatively for all sorts of reasons in Earth system science. What is the area, age, and composition of igneous rocks in the upper crust? How have shallow continental seas and biodiversity varied in time and space? How have rates of biotic extinction varied, and what are the environmental correlates? And then these and a host of other questions require synthesis of data sets from many different sources in order to be able to make progress in these areas. So at a very high level, Macrostrat is simply a relational geospatial database designed to answer these types of questions by aggregating fundamental units of geology. And the paleobiology database is a relational geospatial database designed to answer these and related questions by aggregating taxonomically resolved fossil occurrences. And it's answering these questions that is motivating the infrastructure we're going to be talking about today. So what I'm going to do really briefly is go through an overview of the Macrostrat database, its structure, and give you a brief overview. I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe if there's time, on this system called XDD. It stands for Extracting Dark Data, Digital Library Machine Reading System, that I think can play an important role going forward for helping us in the process of making these data sets. I'll talk briefly about the paleobiology database structure and overview, and then hopefully at the end, we'll have time to really consider some current status questions and future considerations for these data resources. So here we go, we'll launch into Macrostrat, the database structure and overview. When it comes to characterizing the Earth's crust, we require both spatially and temporally focused representations. So on the left here, you see a geologic map-based representation of geology. The spatial structure of rocks in Earth's crust is very important property of the upper crust. And then the temporal distribution of those rocks, how those rocks are arrayed in time, is particularly important for a wide range of questions, particularly in paleobiology. And so any system that attempts to synthesize and quantify information about the Earth's crust has to take these two approaches sort of simultaneously, the spatial and the temporal distribution of rocks in Earth's crust, each of which is telling us something somewhat different. So what Macrostrat attempts to do is, first of all, compile crustal transects at multiple scales. And so here we are peering into the Grand Canyon, and at this miles distance view, we see very coarse lithostratigraphic units that break up the Earth's crust into discrete entities that have identity in time and properties. And that column is sort of summarized, that what you can see in the picture here is sort of summarized at a coarse sort of lithostratigraphic scale for the Earth's transect there on the right. So that scale of resolution has utility for quantifying the Earth's crust. Zooming down into the individual lithology details that we can see in something like this offshore drilling core, this is also a crustal transect compiled at a much finer temporal resolution and spatial resolution. Both of these scales have importance when trying to measure Earth's crust. So what Macrostrat attempts to do is a geospatial database for chronostratigraphic columns at multiple different scales, geological maps, and a bunch of other ancillary data like lithostratigraphic nomenclature that's helpful for making sense and organizing this information. Very quickly, what is the current status of Macrostrat? The column database portion of Macrostrat, currently it consists of about 124,000 lithostratigraphic rock units, multiple different scales, as we'll see, from 3,400 different regions. What we're seeing in this map here is a subset of the columns that cover North America, South America, New Zealand, and a portion of the data set in the deep sea. The remainder of the data set in the deep sea is actually being compiled in the project called EODP, led by Andy Frass at UVic. This is a map showing the distribution of the offshore drilling sites. The blue locations are the IODP era drilling sites that have so far been incorporated into Macrostrat. So that's the other source of data for that 124,000 unit number. Macrostrat's basic column organization, basically a combination of regionally composited chronostratigraphic columns and measured section type columns. So offshore drilling column resolution, for example. They're mostly lithostratigraphic unit scale resolution. I'll say more about units in a minute, but those are the fundamental identity objects in the database. And these units have basic lithology information, thickness, and so on. There's a whole bunch of nomenclature that's applied to these lithostratigraphic units, particularly on the continents, not so much in the deep sea, of course. All units acquire a continuous time age model. I'll say more about that in a minute as well. And this age model is very simple initially based on relative constraints and correlations to chronostratigraphic bins. A whole bunch of samples derived from the crust and measurements pertaining to rock properties have been extracted and integrated with this data set, about 3 million or so of these measurements. Most of them match to individual lithostratigraphic units. All data are incorporated into a paleogeographic reconstruction framework. I'm not going to actually talk about that today, but we have a pretty robust and rapidly developing paleogeographic system for managing these data in spatial context. And then, of course, there's a cyber infrastructure in place to link and distribute data through APIs and so on. Any database talk seems to have a schema component. I actually don't find these particularly useful in this kind of environment to go through, but I put this in here just to remind me to say that the relational structure in Macrostrat basically is subdivided into a spatial component, a temporal component, a nomenclatural component, and then attributes, which broadly define rock properties and things that are linked to rock properties like fossil occurrences in the paleobiology database, mineral occurrences, and resources like MinDat, and so on. At the center of this data structure are things called units, and those are individual lithostratigraphically defined rock units. It is worth going into what this is a little bit more, just because this is the central object that unites all these different data components together. So what constitutes a unit is what we'll talk about briefly here. Units of Macrostrat are lithologically and temporally contiguous intervals of the crust that contain minimally the following: some primary lithology. There may be multiple lithologies that describe the unit. A chronostratigraphic bin assigned to the top and bottom of a unit. It can be relatively coarse, could be Cenozoic, or it could be Pre-Ebonian. Thickness or position of the bottom and top of the unit relative to some datum like meters below seafloor. And then lithostratigraphic nomenclature, environments, and other attributes can be optionally linked to these units. And then there's a system for linking diverse measurements to these units. So it's basically the core descriptive fundamental unit in stratigraphy, the measured package of sediment that is identified contiguously in space and time by properties like lithology. Importantly, in Macrostrat, we don't stop with the definition of units. We actually have boundaries between units, and in Macrostrat, these boundaries take on unique identity themselves and have attributes as a data object in Macrostrat. They're defined by units in contact in a position in time and stratigraphy. Interestingly, the time position can be relative. For example, it can be halfway through the Pre-Ebonian, or it can be absolute. It can be 48.2 million years ago. Boundary model that we developed for this can accommodate a datum within unit, but it's really designed for the units themselves. So to put some examples on here, there's a lot of text, but just to give you a sense, each one of these unit boundaries would have some sort of an identity defined by the unit that's below, in this case, a null. The unit that's above, that's what defines the unit boundary in terms of lithology identity. It will have an age, a position within that age bin, and the type of boundary it is. And those become data objects in Macrostrat. So in this case, we do have, just as an example, we have relative positions assigned to intervals within the Pleistocene, the temporal resolution that was assigned to these unit boundaries in the first place, these units in the first place. And the relative position within the Pleistocene is stored, allowing the boundaries and definitions of the Pleistocene in absolute time to change and have that propagate automatically to the unit's age model. If we drop a datum within this age boundary structure, we can predict its age if we have a position relative to the boundaries, or we can specify that this particular datum has an absolute time position if it's a ash bed or something else that might have geochronological significance. The default age model that's computed for this boundary structure, as you probably inferred from the last introduction, is very general. It's populated with basic constraints to correlatable dated intervals. It usually requires defining some sort of gap-bound package structure, and it has as many anchor points in time as it has lithology unit boundaries. So the lithology structure that you define in your unit model carries directly over to the age model. And the age model is fully editable, but ideally it's always built dynamically with robust methods from data constraints. And on the right, you're just seeing one arbitrary example taken from the offshore drilling program's age model. In the blue, it is a Neptune curated age model. And then the black dots are Macrostrat's automatically computed boundary age model. And I think the old adage applies. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. And for many questions, Macrostrat's age model is wrong, but useful. Okay, just to kind of give you a sense of what these columns look like, the point of aggregating these units into columns and aggregating them together at spatial scales is that we can do analysis of quantity and type and so on. And this is just sort of the most basic measure that we might derive from these types of data. In this example, we're showing column distributions on continental crust in North America, and the different colors correspond to different rock types, not too important for now. But what you can see as we play this little animation that's sort of peeling back the chronostratigraphic stack of rocks on the continent, we're seeing a spatial temporal dynamic play out, and ultimately quantifying the spatial temporal dynamic is the point of our exercise. And we can derive quantities from this, such as the total area of sedimentary rocks of shallow marine environments over time. Don't have time to go into the science of this, but there's all sorts of interesting things that come out of this, this type of time series summary of the aggregate properties of the rock record. Not to leave the offshore drilling world off the charts here, here's EODP. This is just a summary of the total sediment-bearing holes that have been compiled from the IODP era and other eras to date by the EODP project. And you can see here the first order signal, of course, is seafloor spreading and seafloor subduction, which systematically removes material independent of age and gives rise to this sort of canonical exponential with superimposed sampling effects on top of it. So we learn a lot, again, by quantifying and aggregating these data and analyzing them at scale. The Macrostrat geologic map system has a lot of maps in it. I don't have time to go into the detail of how we organize these maps, but it allows us to build some pretty interesting exploratory interfaces that allow the geologic record at the surface to be explored globally. It's completely filterable. So for example, we can filter by Precambrian and igneous and meta-igneous rocks, and this is the surface expression globally of those types of rocks and age, and you can explore the map in that direction. We are experimenting with trying to derive 3D models for the crust by intersecting with topography and doing basic geological cross sections. More on that later, but this is just a little screenshot of the exploratory web interface that allows you to interact with the surface exposed geology and get a lot out of geologic maps. The units are fully filterable, and interestingly, Macrostrat columns have been joined with the geologic maps where it's possible to do that. And so here, for example, we have the Denver Formation, its surface expression in the Denver, Colorado area. Of course, the geologic map has descriptive data. The geologic map also had an age for this. The original age was Maastrichtian to Danian, a very long time interval. And so that's what's shown down here, Maastrichtian to Danian. But in Macrostrat's age model, we actually can zero this in much more precisely based on our dynamically constructed age model. And so we get much higher temporal acuity out of geologic maps when we join them with a temporally focused expression like the columns. We do have a mobile app associated with Macrostrat. You can check it out. There's check-ins that come in from all over the world every day. It's kind of fun to watch the feed and the amazing rocks that people are seeing all over the place. There's a map interface that you can zoom around in and go sort of plan field trips or add to your own field trip collections in a dynamic way. each location sort of gets its own web identity and web presence that's shareable. And so far we've had, it's been well received, and it's an interesting platform for future work to reach a pretty broad and diverse audience. Over 100,000 accounts have been created from global user base. Lots of new signups happening every month. Lots of images coming in. This is an interesting resource that has a lot of potential going forward to for education outreach and potentially some scientific applications as well. One of the utilities of Macrostrat is that it provides basically a semantic space-time scaffolding, I like to think of it as, with which to link and contextualize information. We have the rough picture of the crust. It's not filled in, it's not completed. There's not enough detail in some areas, but we know roughly what the entire structure looks like. And this provides a platform upon which we can add more detailed and complete information. And a lot of that information ultimately comes from the published scientific literature, because we've had, centuries upon several centuries worth of solid work that's descriptively oriented in describing the properties of rocks in the field. So here's just one example. Macrostrat already knows a bunch of the information in this document. It knows that we have the stratigraphic column here. It knows lithostratigraphic nomenclature, rough lithology compositions, and so on. What we don't know in Macrostrat, for example, might be things like stromatolites. And so this little snippet of text here tells us that these two units have stromatolites, and Macrostrat basically provides the blanks that can be filled in by reading systems. And that's where this XDD system comes in. It's a very large collection of documents that's coupled to and readable by a computing infrastructure. Its most basic capabilities that can label terms and known vocabularies that come from data sets like Macrostrat, paleobiology database. And it gives basically random access to specific strings within full text content. And so just as a tangible example, we can take a bunch of nomenclature from the paleobiology database, MinDat, Macrostrat, index that into the scientific literature automatically, and then expose labeled entity tuples that give us a very high level link of scientific papers to database object entities, which is the first step in more complex data extraction tasks. And this, for example, allows us to link the literature in the geologic maps to specific publications. And this is step one for more advanced algorithmic description of these rock units in geologic maps. And so on the right here, you can see automatically highlighted connections to this specific bedrock unit that I'm sitting on here in Wisconsin. We've actually put this to the test by measuring the frequency of stromatolites in the geological record. John Husson and Julia Wilcott spearheaded this work by using Macrostrat to get nomenclature, XDD to get text and processing power, and simple Python scripts to identify mentions of stromatolites in relation to stratigraphic names, a variety of different approaches to link those two, and come up with the very first measurement of quantitative stromatolite frequency relative to the rock record that we've been able to produce. And this one's quite interesting, as it turns out. So that's a real brief overview of Macrostrat and XDD. I'm going to turn next to the paleobiology database. And this, before I even go any further, is worth pointing out. This has a very long history, and I did not originate this. I originated Macrostrat and XDD, but the paleobiology database has a much richer intellectual history behind it. It's really the brainchild of Charles Marshall and John Alroy, and John Alroy did extensive work to build the system early in the 2000s, and it really owes its existence to this group of individuals here: John Alroy, Charles Marshall, among others like Arnie Miller, and at a technical level, Matt Kosnick was instrumental early days in the paleobiology database. So this is what the database website looked like in 2001. And one of the main motivations for creating the paleobiology database was to answer the question, how has diversity changed over time, and be able to provide an answer in a sample standardized way. So a big push in the structure of the database was oriented around that question. And that question was ultimately initially tested in 2001 with an analysis by a group of collaborators who had contributed data to the paleobiology database with a variety of sampling standardization approaches to try to normalize diversity estimates for collection effort. And this provided a somewhat different view potentially of biodiversity that had sort of traditionally been appreciated. This is what the database interface looked like in 2005. It continued to grow, and of course, the utility of the database extended far beyond normalizing diversity estimates for sampling effort, but that continued to be a major thrust. And in 2008, John Alroy and collaborators produced another sampling standardized estimate that filled in that intervening gap in the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic. And this is what the database looked like in 2008. And again, this really started to push the bar and give us a new view of the history of marine biodiversity in the Phanerozoic. That motivated a bunch of work and additional questions and sample standardization approaches and so on. What these authors, what John Alroy, Charles Marshall, Arnie Miller, and others appreciated right from the start is that the structure of the paleobiology database was going to be useful for a wide range of questions, and a wide range of questions has been applied to indeed. The paleobiology database has an incredibly large citation footprint in the scientific literature, has contributed to numerous types of studies spanning from the Earth's current mass extinction scenarios and effects of climate change on biodiversity to the more traditional, in quotes, paleobiology database questions like sampling standardization and so on. It's really an impressive body of work that the database has produced. Today, the paleobiology database looks a little bit different, but fundamentally it hasn't really changed a whole lot since its original creation in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Again, here's sort of the obligate structure. The fundamental structure of the database is arranged in terms of occurrences, which are geographically resolved fossil collection, consist of aggregates of occurrences within a collection. And those occurrences are linked to time scales, time intervals, they're re-identified, and so on. The taxonomic apparatus of the paleobiology database is actually one of the more impressive data structures that it has. It's a dynamic taxonomy that's created by opinions on authorities, taxonomic names, and opinions on the classification of those authorities. And there might be multiple conflicting opinions, but there's an algorithmic solution to generating the taxonomy that resolves those opinions based on recency and quality of opinion. This often gives rise to interesting classifications, but at least it's an objectively defined method for establishing taxonomy. And so the taxonomic apparatus of the paleobiology database is probably one of its most valuable components. Occurrences, geographically resolved taxonomic units are the core of what the paleobiology database is. And then we have a bunch of different sort of derived tables in the paleobiology database that allow us to have a rapidly responsive API. And that's one of the more powerful newer additions to the paleobiology database, is a data service that allows you to develop very rich applications like the paleobiology database navigator application, which my team created, but in principle, anyone could have created using the paleobiology database API. And this is my favorite view of the paleobiology database. This is, if you filter by Phanerozoic and Navigator, it resolves all the different points. And you can kind of see here what we're looking at is a crowdsourced geologic map, basically, because the paleobiology database has been so completely filled in for many parts of the world. And you'll notice, however, there are many parts of the world where there are big blanks. And it's important to realize that some of those blanks are there because of geology. And this is where intersecting the paleobiology database with Macrostrat becomes interesting. If we do a join between paleobiology database and Macrostrat's geologic map system, this is what we see. It's a little fuzzy here in this representation, but these black fields are Precambrian crystalline basement rocks that obviously are not going to have any fossil occurrences in the paleobiology database, no matter how well sampled it is globally. And you can see that there are particular regions of the continental crust that have a large proportion of Precambrian crystalline basement rocks at the surface, or Precambrian sedimentary rocks, which obviously are going to be fossil limited as well. And so some of the spatial disparities you see in this representation here are due to bedrock geology, not due to sampling differences. We've managed to make some small progress in linking the paleobiology database to the literature dynamically. You might have noticed there's this external literature search tab in the taxon view that takes you into the scientific literature through Geo Deep Dive. That's the old name. We should really update that to XDD now, because we cover more than Geo at this point. But what you can see is some interesting things. You know, we search for calamine and we automatically surface related taxonomic names that appear in the same document. Again, illustrating step one for a more complex data extraction pipeline. Okay, that ends the sort of brief overview of where we are with some of the capabilities and basics of the data structure in these two systems. What I want to end with here is a little bit more open. And talk a little bit more about backend, which doesn't lend itself to fancy graphics. So I've kind of put it all on the screen here. Macrostrat and the PBDB are currently separately deployed on the same campus cloud infrastructure, and they do share some software elements. XDD that I mentioned is in the campus Center for High Throughput Computing, is a separate infrastructure resource that has a lot of potential for the future of Macrostrat and PBDB as well. I just want to point out that hosting the PBDB and Macrostrat is not free, and it is not without effort. This requires just keeping the lights on and addressing things that come up routinely with servers like log rotations, although we're getting more and more automated with that. And it does take effort just to sort of keep things moving along. And there are costs associated with hosting these resources that are not trivial and, you know, are worth doing because of the impact that these resources have, but it's an ongoing struggle to figure out how to maintain that support. The biggest infrastructure shift to the PBDB recently has not been something you can see visibly. It's entirely back end, but the system has been completely Dockerized, which means containerized for Docker. It has a command line interface for many key operations related to maintenance and also administration. And this is a huge step towards sustainability. This allows the entire end-to-end system, everything about the paleobiology database, every little software widget to the API to the data itself, to be stood up quickly in a new environment, regardless of the underlying architecture. And so this has been a major effort, but we're done with that now with just a few little loose ends to fix related to log rotation and things like this. But this was a major step for the future of the paleobiology database. Unfortunately, it's not one you can see on a day-to-day use, but for the future, it's incredibly important. Macrostrat is in the process of this containerization. It has a more limited command line, but we're in the process of getting that going forward. And then finally, I just want to leave us with an important point. We are at a really rather important inflection point, I would say, in Macrostrat and the PBDB infrastructure. PBDB's been around a while. Macrostrat has also been around a while. Both resources have grown in terms of their data footprints and software infrastructure that's built around those data footprints. And that means that changing them, developing more around them, is increasingly complicated. And that puts us in an interesting position. It's both an opportunity and a barrier to making progress. But it is something to be aware of, that significant changes to the paleobiology database at the user level are major undertakings because of the legacy code structure we have. And so basically where we are with Macrostrat and PBD is we really need to think seriously about Macrostrat and PBDB 2.0 and what that infrastructure is going to look like and how to maintain and improve it going forward to address the next generation of questions that we need to address in paleobiology. Yeah, I don't think it's worth going into the software stacks down below there. If you're interested, I can field some questions on that. There's a little bit of overlap in the two stacks at a technical level. Virtually there's no software dependencies between the two at this point, but they do have some shared tech. And all of this work really has been substantively supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation. And without that support, we wouldn't have made any progress over the past decade or so. With that, I'll finish up and thank you for your time. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. We have some questions from the audience. If you'd like me to start. So the first question is from Leandro Ledesma. He asks, is it possible to enter data into Macrostrat as a user or authorizer similar to the PBDB?
That is Macrostrat 2.0. We are working towards getting the infrastructure in place to do that. Close collaborators have been able to enter data into the database. So for example, the EODP crew has students and so on entering data from offshore drilling columns. The reason that is not more broadly available right now is those scripts were written by me, and they are not really, I would say, mission critical ready. They're not ready for wide use in a way that could be dependable and reliable and bomb proof. Basically, there's security issues, there's data integrity issues that can potentially come up. It's reasonably good. We've entered 125,000 units this way, so it's not broken, but it's just not ready for prime time. So we're trying to chart a course forward to allowing Macrostrat to become an open public resource for two reasons. One, that's the only way to properly grow this to a global resource by any account. That is the only way to do this, by engaging local expertise for people who know the geology well or have researched the geology and know it well enough to enter data, regardless of whether or not they've worked there. So that's part one. And part two is we need a global representation of age models for the crust so that we can do continuous time analyses and things like the paleobiology database and other linked data resources like geochemical data sets and so on. So all of these things require a collaborative environment, and we are definitely working towards that. And hopefully we'll have some progress soonish. It will really depend on how funding scenarios play out going forward and the usual things.
Thank you. Carl Redden asks about Macrostrat. How close are we to estimating sedimentary rate and local sea level changes in rock packages with regards to their implications on what we see in fossil record, for example, diversity?
Well, it is possible at an individual column level to measure rates of accumulation and to look at spatial structure and rates of accumulation. That is doable. We have joined the Macrostrat data set to the paleobiology data set reasonably completely in the areas where there's columns that have nomenclatural overlap. So that is to say the onshore columns, not the offshore columns. The EODP project is actually incorporating every fossil occurrence that has been described from the offshore drilling site. So in that data set, once we have that fully wrangled into the right spots, will be a phenomenal resource to explore that type of a question between sedimentation rates, spatially, locally, in the intersection with diversity and other paleobiologic quantities. So I think you can do a lot of that. Some of it you can do directly through the APIs in Macrostrat and the paleobiology database, actually, probably reasonably well.
Are you happy for me to keep reading, Adam?
Yeah, just go for it.
All right, so the next one's from Remy Legoff, who says, thank you so very much for the great talk. Concerning the PBDB, is it an automatic link with other taxonomic databases and current distribution databases, for example, worms and GBIF? Is this possible? And how would the taxonomic conflict that exists lead to different issues in diversity studies?
Those are great questions. Currently, the paleobiology database is not externally drawing in automatically other classification systems, other opinion structures on classification of names. It's not externally drawing in it's not an aggregator, let's put it that way. It's not currently an aggregator. What our focus has been on in the development recently and in the past few years has been making the paleobiology database a participant in aggregator applications. So this would be something that, for example, using the API in the paleobiology database, one could draw data automatically into a system that aggregated data from GBIF or other resources and tried to create some sort of mashup of either taxonomy or occurrences. But that has not been our focus in the paleobiology database, partly because we have enough to worry about just with trying to get our own inwardly facing architecture up to snuff for the next 2.0 attempt, basically.
Okay. I want to hear more personally about the 2.0 attempt, but another question was, what has been the biggest bottleneck in terms of the database's development?
The biggest bottleneck has been our ability to recruit and retain talent of the type that's required to do substantive work. I'm a hack. Like the Macrostrat owes its existence to what I've been able to do, but I'm a geoscientist, and I am not a computer scientist or a full-time programmer that has the ability to devote the resources to training and also implementation required to run a state-of-the-art system that we're trying to build in the paleobiology database in Macrostrat. So the biggest limitation has been recruiting and retaining talent. And that's non-trivial because the skill set you need to do this is right in the wheelhouse of the skill sets that drive the modern economy. And so it's a very uphill battle to find people who are willing and able to do the work that needs to happen for this. Now, that said, if we're content to not have industry standard state-of-the-art tech powering our infrastructures, then we can continue to hack our way along in the way we've been doing. But in my opinion, something needs to change for the 2.0 pushes that we're really looking for here. Because to hire and retain a staff person with the talent set required to really do this work now is non-trivial. Like, we need to compete with Twitter and Facebook and Google and Fortune 500 businesses. That's the competition for the job market. So that's my biggest concern with these things moving forward. And the reason 2.0 pushes require them is because our systems are complicated enough now that it's a non-trivial exercise to dive in and even just make any sort of first order progress. If you're starting from scratch, if you have this database idea and I have no data and I have nothing, and you can start it from scratch, you can make a lot of progress pretty quickly on relatively little resources. But once you have a thing that has the infrastructure sophistication of something like the paleobiology database and Macrostrat, it's an entirely different beast and requires an entirely different skill set and an entirely different time frame for doing this. And so everything I've talked about and all the capabilities I showed you, at some level, it's remarkable we have them because of our level of investment that we've been able to make.
Yeah. How do you see the problem from the funding point of view? So if you were to push for Macrostrat and PBDB 2.0 and further integration to everything that you talked about, is there a funding scheme currently that would be sufficient to do this?
Not really. I mean, we're doing the equivalent of startup work, right? And so startups. So if you look at what a startup would entail, like a technical startup would entail, they get venture capital investments that would have a timeline of many years on them, and right now, our venture capital funds are coming from things like NSF, which have not many years, and not a lot of money. And so hiring the staff, it's really hard to hire staff in that environment because there's no future. You're asking somebody to stop their lives and join a project that has effectively no future guaranteed. And so that automatically lowers the bar for talent and expertise recruitment, because there's a bunch of people that are like, I'm never going to do that. And so that handicaps the process. The funding model we need is something that has a longer window and that has a technical staff memory. Because if we were to lose, for example, some of the key personnel in Macrostrat and PBDB right now, we'd be in real trouble. because
Imagine,
we
yeah.
don't have the critical mass required for institutional memory and knowledge structure, which is why that containerization step was such a big deal, because that removes a barrier there that's significant. But that's just the part I struggle with. We don't have a good model currently for funding and support. It may have to be something more like foundation support or something like that to make it viable for the 2.0 lift.
Yeah, and it also has to be, if you were to incorporate funding from all these different sources, you have to somehow future-proof it, and not only to like the people who would come in to work in this endeavor, enterprise, whatever, but also for the people who are willing to contribute to it. So that is, to me, is always the biggest question, because there are like lots of initiatives to like build something great. The question is really what makes them really succeed. And we're talking about two very good case examples, both the PBDB and the Macrostrat. What do you think make them like succeed for for this longer period? Was it the flexibility, or what exactly? Because there are lots of variables, I think, that probably come into play with this, right?
The data. That's what makes them succeed, is the data. I mean, that's at the end of the day, the only reassurance I have in this enterprise, as we'll use the word, is at the end of the day, we have database dumps that encapsulate everything we've done at the most core level. And those database dumps aren't going anywhere. They're easily transportable and easily used. So that's what, at the end of the day, all the other software and all that stuff is secondary to the data underneath the hood. And that's what has made the paleobiology database so successful, is that it has had an international buy-in. People have actually contributed data, some more than others, but it has been a very, very big group effort. And at the end of the day, it's the data footprint that matters. And Macrostrat, it's the same way. Is I didn't build a data system. I started with data and built a system. And that makes it useful right out of the gate for science. And I think that's what has to drive all of this stuff is, at the end of the day, we're trying to facilitate science. That requires data. We're fundamentally data limited. So anything we can do to lubricate the in and out flow of data is the whole point of this stuff. So the paleobiology database's API, I worked hard to get that in place because I viewed that as a platform that will give the data a flexible outlet that allows the community to be creative. And I would like the community to be even more creative with that. There's a lot of potential in those APIs to do amazing things. And we just don't have the time or resources to do them, but I'm hoping that an ecosystem will build up around that going forward.
Okay, this will have to be our last question. And it's from Linna, who was our previous speaker. Welcome back. Geochemistry data is usually in a different scale from Brock units and fossil occurrences, making long-term correlation between them on the same page more difficult. Is incorporating geochemical data into the Macrostrat possible in the future?
It is currently possible. To see an example of that, you can see my recent PhD student, Daniel Sigesiman, did a resynthesis of, basically made a Macrostrat data set for the Ediacaran in North America that's sort of intermediate in scale. He called it Mesostrat. It's sort of like middle scale, not high resolution measured sections, not generalized columns, sort of in between those two resolutions. And he actually compiled into Macrostrat every carbon and oxygen isotope measurement, stable carbon and oxygen isotope measurement that has been made in North America and integrated them in there. And then what happens then is that those acquire the continuous time age model. So if you look at his recent publications, you'll see some figures that illustrate that intersection in those geochemical data sets. So it's possible now. We haven't made a huge push in that space. We have a nascent collaboration with the Sedimentary Geochemistry and Paleo Environments Project, SGP, that will hopefully take that to the next level if we're successful in getting that off.
Okay, I think we should call it there. I'm conscious of everybody's time. I would like to thank you, Shannon, of course, before we finish recording, and to remind everybody that we're taking a break for the next week, and we'll be back shortly with Dr. Aaron Saup presenting the Triton database. So thank you, everyone.